Uh, and we're going to go ahead and dig here into Genesis chapter 29. So again, how I'll do it is I'll just read a paragraph and we'll see what kind of questions you guys have. So Genesis 29 verses 1 through 3, it looks like is the first paragraph. So it says, then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the open country with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. So what do you notice? What questions does it make you ask? Anybody?
Somebody owns that well then.
Yes.
Why was the well sealed?
So they kept the well sealed because this is an area where they don't get a whole lot of rain. And the reality is that if you left it unsealed, then the water would evaporate. And so this is a way of keeping the water there for the shepherds as they need it. It would minimize the evaporation. It would also minimize the amount of dirt and dust that would get down in the well. It's kind of like, you know, we here in the United States, or back when we used to have them, we would cover cisterns. It's the same kind of concept. But do you have any, is there any notion about why a well would be an important thing? Do you guys remember what wells, how they've played into the story up to this point? Anybody?
Well, I imagine that the area was fairly arid and there wasn't a lot of water anyplace. So it was probably a valuable asset to whoever owned it.
Well, and that's absolutely true. But I was thinking more of how wells have played into the story of Jacob and his family.
Their meeting place.
The wells are a meeting place. Yeah. Melissa just said that. But I'm thinking more specifically, remember, where we left Jacob last week is he is fleeing from his brother and he's going back to the land of Terah's people, his father and grandfather's people. And if you remember, whenever his father was going to get a wife, there was a story about a well being a key player in that story. Remember how Abraham's servant went and he said, if whoever you want to marry my master, would you let her come and water my camels? Remember that story? And so I'm certain that Jacob heard this story many times as he was growing up. And so here he is, he's back in the area of his family, and now he's going to the well. And we're going to see this as a kind of a theme here. So I'm going to go ahead and read the next couple of verses. I'm going to read 4 through 7. And
A place of promise.
yeah, the wells are kind of a place of gathering, but it's also a place of promise. And the area where, Jim, as you were saying, that there'd be a lot of value in having a well. The reality here is that this well is going to bring more than just water. And so I'm going to go ahead and read verses 4 through 7, and we'll see how the story unfolds a little bit. Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brothers, where are you from?" "We're from Haran," they replied. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said. "And here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." "Look," he said, "the sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture." "We can't," they replied, "until the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep." So here you have this notion where all these shepherds are gathering around waiting for all the sheep to get there so that they can water them. And you remember that notion of the long journey and watering the camels, but in particular, it's interesting because these shepherds could have moved the rock out of the way and watered their sheep and then just, left Rachel and her flock to not worry about it. But they were waiting for everyone to gather together and everyone to be there for the rock to be moved away. It was waiting for the right time to do it. Does that make sense? So let's go ahead and we'll read the next kind of paragraph and see if that continues to add to the notion. Verse 9. While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherd. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and a son of Rebekah. So she ran and told her father. So, I mean, like many of our stories, there's been some parts of these that it definitely is a little more forward than what we might normally think of within our culture. But the reality is, Jacob could have moved that stone away for the other shepherd sheep, but he didn't. Whenever Rachel shows up, he decides, yeah, I'm going to help her out. And of course, the other shepherds could have moved the stone too, but they were choosing not to. So there's this reality of now where with Isaac and Rebekah was the one who watered the sheep to show that she was the one that God had chosen for Isaac. But in this story, Jacob is the one who's doing the work of the watering. And so it's kind of this circular where God started it with watering, and now he's kind of bringing it full circle. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So any thoughts or questions about that, or do I go ahead and read?
This is the first time we've heard that a woman is a shepherd.
Okay, so Melissa does bring up another interesting point. This is the first female shepherd we've heard of. And if you remember in our discussions about shepherds, as a whole, shepherds are not, well, they're mostly outsiders, but as a whole, they're mostly seen as expendable people. So what do you think that says about Laban's feelings for Rachel?
I mean, she's a second born. I mean, she's not the oldest daughter, so.
Right. It would imply that she's not the oldest daughter. She's not the one that's expected to bring in, a wealthy suitor. She's a shepherd. She can be kind of sent out in the pasture, and it's not that big of a deal, if that makes sense. In some ways, it might imply that for Laban, Rachel is the less favored daughter. Does that make sense? Oh, let's keep reading the story and see. So it doesn't tell us who owns the well, though.
And who pulled the rock off the well?
Jacob is the one who pulls the rock off for this watering, at least for Rachel's flock.
I wonder if they weren't waiting for the owner to pull the rock off.
It would make sense that you would wait for the owner of the well to pull the rock off, but if it's Laban's well,
or a representative from the family to pull the rock off.
I'm looking back over to this, and I don't think it really tells us who the well belongs to. No, I don't see anything there.
Okay.
Well, then let's pick up with verse 13 and see how the story progresses. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood." After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. So this story is progressing pretty fast, but there's this reality. It's interesting because remember whenever Rebecca was sent off to marry Isaac, Laban was kind of in a hurry to get rid of her. He was willing to kind of sell her off for the highest bride price he could get. And he and his mother made out really well, even though their father should have been the one who made the deal. But in this situation, Laban seems to have mellowed out a little bit. He's not quite as, he's a little more hospitable than he might have been earlier, if that makes sense. You see him being kind to his family, where in the past, at least with his father, it was more about, being greedy. Yeah. Somebody got a question, or we keep going? All right, then let's keep going. Verse 16 of chapter 29, 16 through 18. Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, I'll work for you for 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. Any thoughts or questions about this paragraph?
Do you think that she may have been cross-eyed?
There have been a lot of speculation about this, that either she was cross-eyed, she might have had a lazy eye. By the same token, this same phraseology could mean something that she had stunning eyes. Stunning, like eye-catching, like beautiful, like and so, I mean, if most Bibles say, they say that the meaning of this word is not completely understood. But more than likely, the reality is, I think that there's something about the fact that Jacob loved Rachel and he was just okay with Leah, if that makes sense. We all have our preferences.
At that time, wanted to marry their oldest daughter first.
Well, see, and therein lies part of the problem of what's going to happen. In the story, we're going to see that Laban says it's not right for Rachel to be married first.
Yeah.
And that's going to play in for certain.
I've got two other translations here. One of them says that Leah's eyes were delicate, and the other one says Leah had nice eyes.
So the actual Hebrew word tends to be translated more often than not as tender. And so what exactly that would mean in this situation, that doesn't tend to be a descriptor that we use for eyes. So the meaning of what the storyteller is trying to tell us is kind of, I'm certain it's probably an idiom, and it's probably an idiom that we don't fully understand what he's getting at. So, which is why on the one hand, you have some people go beautiful eyes and some people go lazy eyes. It's just like, it could be that she just didn't like the sunshine. It could be that she had sensitive eyes.
Maybe she needed glasses.
Maybe she needed glasses. We really don't know, and the word doesn't help us a whole lot. But part of what has happened in tradition is that because Jacob liked Rachel so much more, they have a tendency to think that maybe she didn't have very beautiful eyes. Maybe she's cross-eyed, maybe she was wall-eyed or had a lazy eye or whatever. That's where tradition has tended to come down on this. But that we don't really know, if that makes sense.
It specifically said that Rachel had a nice formed body.
Right?
But she was also a shepherd, so she was out actually working in the fields and physically strong.
Correct.
But Leah was more likely at home and pampered.
Could be.
So it may have been that she didn't see he was worthy of her and may have just looked at him wrong. Gave him a cross eye.
Who knows?
She wouldn't be attracted to him.
Did you guys hear Melissa's point she was trying to make? So one of the things she said is, it makes it a point of saying that Rachel was a shepherdess and she was out in the fields and she was working and that she had a good figure and was beautiful. And it could be that because Rachel was the one who was working with the sheep, Leah was probably the one who was home. She was probably the one who was pampered and protected in the tents. And, especially if it was something more like she had sensitive eyes, then she probably wouldn't go out a whole lot. And so it could simply be that Jacob is just more attracted to that formed, rugged, dark complected woman instead of the fair woman who's in the house all the time. I don't know. What we do know is that Jacob has asked for Rachel, and she is the younger daughter. And so to your point, Diane, I'm going to read on so that we can get to that point. And so we're looking at verse 19 here, and I'm going to read 19 through 21. Laban said, "It's better that I give you to her than some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her." There you go. I mean, you can't get much more forward than that, I guess.
What's on that shelf?
But there's a part of me that wants to ask Leah, do you think you could imagine a 7-year engagement? That seems a bit long for our culture, doesn't it? We'll read on 22 through 24. So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her, as Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. So we already see a little bit here of Laban falling into that family deception. We saw it with Sarah and Abraham. We saw it with Rebecca, helping Jacob to deceive. And Amy says, but he also had 7 years to marry Leah off, and makes me wonder if that was Laban's plan all along. Yeah, the reality is with, there was this notion of trying to maybe find a mate for Sarah or for Leah, and it just didn't happen. But so right here at the end, when Jacob should be marrying his bride, the woman he has agreed to work for Laban for 7 years, he instead gets Leah. Bare minimum, it shows that Laban's not necessarily the most scrupulous person. They might worship the right God, but they don't really have God's integrity, do they? Any thoughts or questions, or keep reading?
Must have been a pretty dark night if you couldn't tell the difference.
That's a lot of veiling.
Okay, on that note, we'll keep going.
Really strong drink on that.
A little strong drink. Verse 25. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? Laban replied, it is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work.
Uh,
Yeah, Amy, I think you're right. This really doesn't feel fair to Leah because she's thrown into this relationship and she's known all along that Jacob had a thing for her sister. It really doesn't quite feel fair to Leah. It definitely doesn't feel fair to Rachel.
Wondering why she was 7 years.
Yeah, more and more deceit, Chris. What was that, Dean?
Leah's got a question about what. So you want to know why Leah was. So Leah's wondering, well, why wasn't Leah married off during that 7 years? Jacob was working to get Rachel.
It could be that Laban had this plan all along. It could be that Laban didn't find any other men that were worth marrying his daughter off to. It could be that Leah said she didn't want anybody else other than Jacob. Just being honest, we don't really know. What we do know is that it probably should have happened over the course of 7 years, and Leah doesn't get married off. Rachel, of course, is betrothed. That's a really long betrothal, and Laban decides to pull a switcheroo, and apparently he thinks that Jacob loves Rachel so much that he'll just go ahead and put up with this. I mean, the very next paragraph, I'll read that. It's 28 through 30. It says, and Jacob did so. He's like, okay, I guess I get 2 wives for 14 years worth of work. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, and he worked for Laban another 7 years. One, I would say Jacob's not really a very good negotiator. 2, this seems like a fairly long period to work for a bride price. But then by the same token, if we remember, when Jacob shows up, Jacob doesn't have anything. He has not a penny to his name. And so I don't know, I don't know what a typical bride price would have been, but it seems like that he was definitely working for it. To the questions in the chat, I do think there's a reality, Chris, that Leah had to know. I mean, he asked specifically for Rachel first. He didn't ask for Leah, he asked for Rachel. And so the fact that he worked for 7 years, Leah had to know that if she got married to Jacob, she was going to have second fiddle. I mean, and to your point, Amy, this notion that Leah may have thought that she should have Jacob to herself for 7 years, or at least during that time period that she could win him over. I mean, we see that kind of stuff happen all the time today, don't we? Where people fall in love with the wrong person and they think they can win them over. They think they can make them fall in love with them. And sometimes it works, but more often than not, it doesn't. And we're going to see in this relationship, it really doesn't work as well as they all had hoped. I mean, I guess the only person who comes out ahead in this is really Laban. Laban gets 14 years worth of free labor for his 2 daughters. So
He also didn't make him wait another 7 years before he took it as a bride. He gave him to her immediately, but he still had to work 7 years.
Right, right. So in a sense, Leah really is the one who gets shortchanged on this.
Happy to get married.
But then, as Melissa just said, maybe she was just happy to be married. And to know that she had a future with somebody who was a hard worker.
Well, Jacob got more out of than just the girls, though.
Well, this is true.
He did come with nothing but his staff, and although he worked for him for 7 years for Rachel and 7 years for Leah, he also had room and board, which, if you think about today, how much money you have extra after you pay for your basics, well, you don't really make a lot extra. Most people don't. Another just basically the room and board. So it was 7 years, even though that's a lot. If you think about how much people actually save in 7 years time.
Talk about him.
Well, and Amy, while you're technically correct, and he gets the 2 servants, they're not concubines at this point.
Oh, they're turning into concubines.
We know the story. Yes, they eventually become, I guess you'd say, another set of wives for Jacob, but he at least comes out with, for those of you who didn't know, that was my dad who chimed in. So Jacob gets room and board for 14 years. He gets 2 brides and he gets 2 servants. So I guess it's probably not a bad deal, but I still think Laban probably still gets the most out of this deal.
Oh, yeah.
Especially considering here in the next couple of chapters, we're going to see that Jacob is actually a really good shepherd, and the flocks and herds flourish under his leadership. So
That's why I always thought that's why he wanted him to have Leah, because he saw, like he said, he was always blessed by what Jacob did. So he knew that he needed to have someone that he could really make money off of.
Tying down a little bit more.
he absolutely ties him to the family a little bit more by having Jacob marry 2 of his daughters.
All in the family, man. All in the
And there's a sense in which probably Laban thinks that he's going to just stick around and not go back. Any other thoughts and questions about this part? Because the next section gets a little interesting. And if I had been in person, I probably would be using the whiteboard for it, because it gets a little confusing on who goes with which one. But are there any questions or thoughts on the first 30 first 30 verses of chapter 29? I'm not for sure if that was a question or not, but if not, then let's go ahead and go on. What I think I'll do is I'm just going to read this, the whole section, and then we'll come back through and digest it, because there's a lot here. So verse 31, and we'll just read until we get to the end of this story. And then like I said, we'll come back and digest it. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." She conceived again, and when she had given birth to a son, she said, "Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he has given me this one too." So she named him Simeon. Again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons." So he was named Levi. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "This time I will praise the Lord." So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God, who has kept you from having children?" Then she said, "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son." Because of this, she named him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won." So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "What good fortune." So she named him Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "How happy I am. The women will call me happy." So she named him Asher. During wheat harvest, Reuben went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too?" "Very well," Rachel said. "He can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." So when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to meet him. "You must sleep with me," she said. "I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he slept with her that night. God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, "God rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband." So she named him Issachar. Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, "God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor because I have borne him six sons." So she named him Zebulun. Sometime later, she gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, "God has taken away my disgrace." She named him Joseph and said, "May the Lord add to me another son." You know, if we thought that maybe Jacob's generation would learn the lessons from Isaac and Abraham's generation, I think they just multiplied it.
They just said he's birthing his own army.
I'm not for sure if that's a question or not, but you know, the reality is he's definitely had a lot of children. We have 12 that are accounted for so far. 7 by Leah, 2 by her servant, 2 by Rachel's servant, and now 1 by Rachel. And you notice all the way through this, does Leah ever get the love that she's wanting from her husband?
No.
I haven't seen it.
We haven't seen it yet. I've told many a couple as I've counseled them before they get married. If you don't come to a conclusion beforehand about how many kids you want and how you want to raise kids, don't think that bringing kids into the situation is going to make things better. Oftentimes it just causes more strife and heartache. Now, sometimes it does bring the couple together and they can work things out and it becomes a great source of joy. But for the most part, kids don't make marriages stronger. What's the relevance of mandrakes? So there is a notion that the mandrake is an aphrodisiac, that it was an herb that was used to help people conceive children.
That's the pharmacist.
I don't know, Jim, have you heard of that? Is there any truth to that?
Well, we didn't sell mandrake at the pharmacy.
I don't know that there's any truth to it. Of course, we know that, conceiving is what conceiving is. It's just somewhat a matter of luck. But in the ancient world, they believed that there were a lot of different things you could do to help increase fertility. And so the mandrake plant was one that was supposedly good for that. And so whenever Leah's son finds it, she uses that as a bargaining chip. Or Rachel's, I'm trying to remember, got to get back to the right verse. Verse 16. Or I guess it was a little earlier than that. But yeah, so the reality is we have here Reuben finds these mandrake plants. He brings them to his mother, Leah. This, in theory, should be something to help Leah conceive, but Rachel wants them so that she can conceive. And so Leah trades off this tool that should, in theory, help her get pregnant to her sister. But in exchange, she kind of goes off. I mean, granted, this is kind of getting into that other box over here that I don't always like dealing with, but the reality is you can't get away from it in this chapter. I mean, I don't know that any guy wants to come home and say, you have to sleep with me tonight. Now, most guys would probably find a way to make it work, but it still doesn't necessarily put one in the mood. And yet the reality is, in the midst of it, God still blesses it. And Leah conceives again. The other interesting thing I've always wondered about this is, you notice that Bilhah doesn't get to name her own children, and neither does Zilpah. They are, for all intents and purposes, just surrogates for Rachel and Leah, even though it says in this chapter they're given as wives. They're actually elevated to the status of more wives, but their children don't belong to them.
Is it that they made them as wives so that it indicated he slept with them and not just as servants?
I don't know, because the reality is, in further chapters, they're not going to refer to them as wives later on either. They're still going to be referred to as servants. So it almost is more of a surrogacy than it is being elevated to wife level.
Here's something to add confusion to what you said, Sam.
Go for it.
Mandrake. An extract of mandrake plant used as folk remedy as an emetic, cathartic, and anthelminic effects. Now, emetic would be for nausea, cathartic, constipation, and anthelminic is for worms.
As Melissa just said, I guess if you've got those problems, then getting rid of those problems would absolutely help you conceive.
There you go.
That's what I was thinking too, that, we think of them just being every day, but, without any medications back then, like most people would probably be a little ill a lot of the time.
Right. But leave it to the pharmacist to bring in the medical side of things.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks,
That's what we
Jim.
wanted.
Oh, my pleasure.
So does anybody want to be a part of this family and try and figure out holidays? So
Looks
you
like
have
every day
two.
is gonna be a holiday someplace along the line.
I mean, the dynamics of this family are just a little bit on the ridiculous side. If we thought that we had the Jerry Springer show before this, we definitely have it now.
They're all very definitely inbred.
There's definitely a level of inbred in this, yes. You have one guy marrying two sisters, and then you have him having kids with both of them and seeking to find the sisters seeking to find love and approval through having kids. And then you have them throwing a couple other women into the mix just because that's got to make things better, right? I mean, it worked so well with Sarah and Hagar, so we might as well try it now. And you end up with, I mean, there were five kids in my house growing up, and it was crazy, but I can't imagine 12 of them from 4 different mothers. It's just makes me think a lot of the show Melissa used to watch, the Sister Wives thing. There had to be a lot of drama in that household.
Well, Jacob had to be exhausted.
There's probably a reason he spent a lot of time out with in the fields with the flocks.
That's why he was such a good shepherd.
Any questions or thoughts on this section with the kids before we move on?
There's one, Sam. Can you hear me?
Sure.
The names that Leah gives versus the names that Rachel gives.
Right.
Leah's
Okay.
are all positive.
Yes.
Rachel's are not.
Hmm.
And that seems strange because you think Leah, who is the downtrodden, would be more bitter.
Right.
Just observation. It's like wow, that's
It's not her children, so she's not.
You,
happy.
you know, there's this reality that Rachel is the one who is loved, and yet she seems to just want to prove that she's better than her sister. And yet Leah is the one who is not loved, and she's just like you said, Charles, she's just finding joy in the fact that God has blessed her with children. She's also being hopeful that maybe this will be the turn in her fortunes with her husband. But yeah, I hadn't really paid attention to that. Leah's names are hopeful and positive. Rachel's kids' names are not. And of course, her final son is even worse. So we're not there yet, but it continues that trend.
That's the way it is a lot of time when someone's blessed from the start. Why they don't appreciate things. Someone that's, not had things the way they want, they really, when they have something given to them, well, they appreciate it a lot more and think more highly of it.
That's very true. Very true. Any other thoughts before we jump into the next section? All right, then verse 25 of chapter 30. We'll do 25. I'll do 25 through 28. That's 2 paragraphs. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He added, "Name your wages and I will pay them." So what do you think? What do you notice?
No more women.
No more women. He wants money now, right?
What's divination or whatever that is?
So divination is, generally speaking, is the process by which someone appeals to the gods in order to find out what is the best path forward. In general, for us as Christians, we would do this through prayer, but that's how we beseech God. That's how we talk with God. That's how we find out what God wants. But at this point in time, oftentimes they would do this not just for our God, but for any God. And a lot of times that would involve some kind of ritual. It would probably involve some kind of sacrifice. It might be something as simple as reading the tea leaves, if you've heard people use that phrase before. You know, there was a lot of different ways to do it. I tend to want to give Laban a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here, that he was probably beseeching God, because part of the reason why Abraham said to go back and find Rachel or Rebecca for Isaac is because at least Laban's family worshiped God Most High. They worshiped Yahweh. And so I hope and pray that this isn't a more nefarious version of divination. By the time you get to the New Testament, divination is almost exclusively dealt with animal sacrifice and talking to the dead. Like I said, I want to give Laban a little bit of the benefit of the doubt on this one, but by them using the word divination, it means that it may not be as wholesome, if that makes sense.
Do you know what the Hebrew word is there is used?
Let me grab that real quick. 27.
Isaac's wife, though, what was her religion? She wasn't. They didn't worship God, though, did they?
So the Hebrew word, it actually, I don't know this word.
Uh-oh.
Well, listen.
Augured. I have augured. It says it could mean divination, or I've paid attention. My experience, it almost could be as easy. A way of saying this might be, I've watched how God has blessed you, and he's blessed me because you're working with me.
That's
So
what I wondered, because in King James, it just says, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for thy sake. Basically, King James is just saying, I've been watching you, so I knew that just by watching you that, that I've been blessed.
I don't know the word augured. Augured. I want to look that one up real quick. That's not something we use in everyday language today.
Maybe one of those you guys start trying.
Probably not.
It basically, yeah, it means watching for the signs. So yeah, I think probably King James here is maybe a little bit of a better translation, that I've just paid attention and seen the signs that God has blessed me because of you.
So blessed by association.
I mean, by the same token, if you use the raw understanding of the word divination, then like I said, we as Christians, we seek God's will through prayer, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually a very valid thing for us to do through prayer, is to ask for God's will. So I'm not for sure.
I mean, they could say divination because just God, they controls all nature. And so he could say, well, just by, experience of two, I'd be divining what God would have for me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which I'd probably agree with that kind of notion. It's kind of a both and situation. There's a sense in which when you've walked with God for a long period of time, God doesn't necessarily have to come out and do the miraculous for you to know that he's there and working and doing things in your life. There's a sense in which you just have that patient endurance of knowing God has been at work, God is at work, and God will be at work regardless of whether I see him or not. And that's part of the reason why a lot of times whenever I pray and I thank God for the blessings of this day, a lot of times I'll say for those that we've noticed and for those that we haven't noticed, because God is still at work, even if we don't see him moving. And so there's a sense in which, Laban has been paying attention these last 14 years, and he's seen that God has blessed Jacob's work. So here in the NIV, I think this notion of the word divination might be pushing it a little further than maybe what the Hebrew said. And Chris, you're absolutely right. He's being selfish, thinking he will be blessed more if Jacob stays. That's right. I mean, we've already seen Laban's character as one where he wants to bless himself. And he wants what's best for him. But most people have that kind of notion. And Amy, you're right. Like you said earlier, anybody who tries to keep having kids as if that's going to make things better usually creates unhappy childhood, unhappy home. It doesn't make for a good situation for certain. Any other thoughts before we move into the next paragraph? All right, 29 through 30. Jacob said to him, "You know how I have worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" So in a sense, sounds like Jacob is agreeing. It's more about experience and paying attention to what God has done. Any thoughts or questions, or keep going? All right, 31 through 33. "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied, "but if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all of your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages, and my honesty will testify for me in the future. Whenever you check on the wages you have paid me, any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored will be considered stolen." Anybody know something about sheep and goats and coloring?
I would say that there would probably be crossbreeds, which are usually stronger than purebred.
Well,
If they're
you don't want
spotted.
and speckled. You want the white, because then you can dye it any color you want. You can't cover the black spots.
Amy, I'm sure you're right. Joe would absolutely know, but that's the thing. On the one hand, it makes it very clear, a very clear delineation between what should be Jacob's and what should be Laban's. But I can't help but wonder if this doesn't feel like who's trying to pull something over on whom. Does Jacob know something that Laban doesn't, or does Laban know something that Jacob doesn't?
That's why I say, they would be less valuable according to what you're wanting. But if you're wanting to grow your herd, you would want the most strong. And like I said, usually the spotted, usually the mixed breed are tend to be the most virile. They'd be more likely to expand and grow. And so, it would be that'd be the one if you wanted to increase your herd and not just get, specific, like I said, the white for dying.
So on the one hand, he is taking what seems like it would be a less valuable sheep and goats. But on the other hand, like my dad was just saying, he's probably taking what would be the stronger goats and would make for a better herd.
I think he probably had a hidden market for spotted hides, and he was gonna capitalize on that.
With the way this family has been working, Jim, it wouldn't surprise me one bit that Jacob didn't know something about spotted and speckled hides that Laban didn't.
They couldn't use them at the Senate. They couldn't use them for sacrifice. So, I mean, you couldn't go and sell them
Well,
for
so
sacrifice purposes, but you could sell them for meat purposes.
to be honest with you, dear, at this point in time, they didn't have that notion yet.
Well, there you go. Then I guess it doesn't matter.
We know that down the road, when the Israelites form a more formalized faith, that they will ask for only unblemished lambs. And of course, by the same token, let's just be honest. Jacob has not been anything close to unblemished. So maybe it's fitting that he's getting the spotted and speckled sheep.
I mean, after 14 years of it, he should know exactly which kind of animals were the healthy ones and which would be the most to survive. If he's been the one basically running the whole herd all this time.
I would agree with that too. So in some ways, Jacob knows a little bit more about the herd than what Laban does. So let's see how Laban responds. 34 through 36. Agreed, said Laban. Let it be as you have said. That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. So he put his sons in charge of the ones that were supposed to be Jacob's, and he put Jacob in charge of the ones that were supposed to be his. Am I reading that right?
Mhm.
Nothing shady about that at all, is there?
Depends on who his is. Is it his Laban's sons or is it his Jacob's sons?
Yeah, where's the his at?
Is it his sons, but Laban's extra sons, or Jacob's sons could be 12, 13 years old. He could have been actually let Jacob take care of his kids, take care of their stuff.
Well, let's see. Let's see what the Hebrew says. It would be Laban's sons, based on the way the Hebrew is written. So either he expects his sons to not care enough as much as Jacob did, or he's maybe trying something a little more sinister in it.
Well, here's another take a look at it. He pulled all the spotted out before Jacob could go out and get them. Therefore, when Jacob would go get the spotted ones, there were none.
The Bible says.
Ooh, that's even more nefarious yet, isn't it?
Because it says that very night, he went out and pulled them all out.
Yeah, I think this is probably, he put them in the care of his own sons.
Yeah.
But I mean, the way we've been studying this family, it wouldn't surprise me in the least if Laban isn't trying to pull something over. We've definitely discovered that that God works with just about anybody. Any other thoughts before we read the rest of the chapter? All right, 37 then. Jacob, however, took fresh cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and made white strips on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they made it in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so that they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. So for Laban's apparently attempted treacherousness, Jacob pulls his own.
Yeah.
And of course, we would come to almost expect nothing else, would we?
That's right.
You know, it's definitely, we're definitely getting a character study here in Jacob, that the name deceiver definitely fits him, doesn't it? And again, just like we said last week, the reality is, in some ways, this is sad and disheartening that this is the family God's trying to bring his blessing through. This is what they're like. This is the kind of people they are. But yet, by the same token, it should also give us hope that if God would work with some unruly people like this, what's that mean for those of us who are trying to be better? We're at 8:15, and the next chapter kind of gets into a bigger story that I think we want to wait on. So are there any other thoughts that you guys have before we call it quits for tonight?
I said to Jim on the way home last week, is this the Jacob that had the son Joseph, a coat of many colors? And it is. I mean, finally we get down to the last one, but in that story, it said he was the favored one.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to get there.
I was hoping it was the same family, but you can see how the deceitfulness goes on and on.
Maybe it goes all the way down to all the brothers.
All the
deceive
brothers
their dad.
kind of get deceitful, and they deceive their dad. And we're going to read that story here in a couple of weeks. I don't think we'll get to it
Joseph
next week.
deceives his brothers
And of course, Joseph deceives his brothers too. And it's just a nice family trait. You know, we're all a bunch of deceivers.
Well, we tried to.
Kids
be
learn
better.
from their parents.
You know, another thing it may teach us is we should teach our children not to mate in front of striped branches because they get spotted kids.
You want me to turn him off?
Well, as we kind of wrap things up, I'll keep working on the technology, but of course I should be in person next week, so that'll solve that part. Planning to be in person on Sunday for those of you who are able to come out. I'll stay up on the chancel and wear a mask just to be safe, but I'm grateful that we don't have a worse version of this disease than what we do. You know, reading this story, going through Genesis as we have, it just keeps reminding me how blessed we are and how, you know, every time I think my life has struggles, I read these stories and I'm like, man, I've got a blessed life. And I've been treated really well throughout my life. And so I'm just really grateful for that. And I hope that you guys are too. Anything else for the good of the cause before I pray and we end? Well, then let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you for the many blessings of this day, both those that we've noticed and we thank you for, and those that went unnoticed. Lord, we are grateful to know that you are with us every moment of every day, and you never leave us or forsake us. Even when we are the most despicable versions of ourselves, Lord, you still love us and you still seek to draw us into your kingdom and to become more like your Son. Lord, we pray that as we continue to read the story of our family, your family, this family of faith, Lord, I pray that we'll learn these lessons, and Lord, we'll live lives that honor you, and that when the world looks at us, that they'll see you and they'll want what we have in you. We thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
And the recording